Let me share a story with you. My name is Arthur Vance, and this is about the day my stepson decided to inform me that I was an unwelcome presence in the very house I called home. It's also the story of how I orchestrated a response so complete that he would forever be haunted by the moment he lost every privilege he believed was his birthright. It all came to a head the instant my stepson, Leo, stared directly into my eyes and declared, "You are not welcome in this house until you get over this idea." In that moment, something deep inside me fractured. He was convinced he held all the power. He mistook his mother's silence for a victory flag, a sign that he had won. But what he failed to comprehend was that the very house he was attempting to exile me from was already, in the eyes of the law, half mine. And, before he had a chance to fully grasp the situation, not only would the house be gone, but it would belong to the one person he never imagined would be standing on that front porch again, his ex-wife. Allow me to go back to the beginning and explain how I arrived at that fateful moment, seated at my own dining table, being told I was an intruder in my own home. I was 52 when I married Eleanor, and when I moved in, I found myself in a place that felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. Every single room was a snapshot frozen in time, preserved exactly as her late husband, Richard, had left it 3 years prior. His collection of colognes still stood in perfect formation on the bathroom vanity. His favorite coffee mug, the one with the sailboat on it, remained untouched in the kitchen cupboard. Even the spectacles he used for reading were still resting on the nightstand, as if waiting for him to return and pick up a book he would never finish. Eleanor simply couldn't bring herself to alter a single thing, and I sympathized with her grief. I truly did. But there is a vast difference between understanding a sentiment and being forced to live inside it day after day. Make this place your own, Eleanor had told me on the night we were married. But how can a man ever feel at home in what is essentially a shrine to someone else? How do you hang your suits in a closet where the clothes still carry the faint scent of another man? How do you prepare a meal in a kitchen where every single skillet holds the memory of dinners you were never a part of? The house itself, however, wasn't the core of the problem. The real issue was Leo. Eleanor's 34-year-old son possessed his father's piercing blue eyes and his mother's unyielding stubbornness, and he wielded both of these traits like weapons against me from the very first day. To him, I wasn't merely an intruder, I was a usurper, a man trying to steal his father's place before the memory of him had even begun to fade. "He is not my father," I overheard him whisper to Eleanor one evening when he thought I was out of earshot. "And he never will be." Eleanor's reaction was invariably the same: absolute silence. She would clear her throat, pivot the conversation to something trivial, or simply exit the room. Not once did she ever stand up for me. Not once did she ever remind her son that, as her husband, I was owed a measure of respect. That profound silence was more cutting than any insult Leo could ever hurl at me. The first major confrontation erupted during the preparations for Thanksgiving. I had suggested I could help with the cooking, hoping that perhaps we could find some common ground over something as mundane as dicing onions. Leo arrived that morning, arms laden with grocery bags, wearing an expression that could have turned water to ice. "I'll be handling the cooking," he stated, his gaze fixed on some point over my shoulder. "Dad's recipes, the way Mom likes them." "I'd be happy to help," I offered, my tone gentle. "Maybe I could take care of the mashed potatoes." Or, "No thank you." His voice was frigid. "This family has its traditions that you couldn't possibly understand." Eleanor was standing in the doorway, a witness to the entire exchange. I glanced at her, a flicker of hope in my chest, waiting for her to intervene. Surely, she would tell her son that I was now a part of this family too. Instead, she picked up her teacup and vanished into her office, leaving me standing in the kitchen feeling like a chastised schoolboy. I passed that entire Thanksgiving meticulously arranging napkins and staying completely out of the way while Leo prepared his father's dishes in what he clearly still viewed as his father's kitchen. When it was finally time to eat, he had set a framed photograph of Richard at the head of the table, precisely where I, as Eleanor's husband, should have been seated. I was relegated to a corner seat, feeling less like family and more like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. Dad always said the secret to a perfect brisket was slow cooking, Leo declared, carving the meat with a dramatic flair. He would spend hours at the smoker, never rushing it. He understood that quality takes time. The subtext was impossible to miss. I was the hasty decision, the convenient replacement, the man who lacked an appreciation for patience and tradition. Eleanor just nodded in agreement, reminiscing about Thanksgivings of the past and praising the familiar tastes. It was as if I had become invisible. Christmas was even more unbearable. Leo was adamant about decorating the tree in the exact manner his father had always done, using the same ornaments placed in their identical, time-honored positions. He hung Richard's stocking right next to Eleanor's and his own, leaving no space whatsoever for mine. When I brought it up with Eleanor later, in a quiet moment, she just offered a weary shrug. "He's still processing his grief," she said. "The holidays are particularly difficult for him. Just give him some time." But how much time was I supposed to give? How many more holidays would I have to endure, feeling like a complete stranger in my own house? How many more family events would I have to sit through, being treated as if I had no right to be there? The absolute breaking point arrived that first spring. I had planted a small bed of sunflowers and zinnias in the front garden. It was nothing elaborate, just a splash of color to liven up the entrance and make the house feel, even in a small way, like it was mine, too. For a few wonderful weeks, seeing those vibrant flowers every morning as I left for work brought a smile to my face. It felt as if I had finally managed to add a personal touch to the place. One afternoon, I returned from the grocery store to find my flowers violently uprooted, their stems broken and wilting on the hot driveway. The soil where they had grown was turned over and raked perfectly smooth, as if the garden bed had never existed. I just stood there, my hands full of grocery bags, staring at the deliberate destruction, the feeling in my gut like I'd taken a punch. Leo stopped by. Eleanor mentioned offhandedly when I found her reading in the living room. He said Richard always kept that area clear because he preferred the clean lines of the lawn. My flowers had been ripped out for that. Eleanor seemed uncomfortable, avoiding my gaze. He was just trying to help, maintain the property's aesthetic. He knows a lot about landscaping. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the darkened ceiling, listening to the rhythm of Eleanor's breathing, a hard truth solidified in my mind. This was never going to change. Leo would never come to accept me, and Eleanor would never challenge him. I could plant 1,000 gardens, and he would dig them all up. I could spend a lifetime trying to carve out a place for myself in this family, and I would forever remain the outsider peering through the window. But I wasn't prepared to throw in the towel. Not just yet. I held on to a sliver of hope that patience and persistence could still win them over. So, I continued to try. I began to manage the household finances, as Eleanor seemed completely overwhelmed by the stacks of paperwork that had accumulated since Richard's passing. She had always depended on her late husband to handle their money, and after he was gone, the bills just sat in a growing pile on his old desk until threatening notices started to appear in the mail. "You've always had a good head for numbers," she said, handing me a thick folder of statements with an expression of pure relief. Richard always took care of this sort of thing. I never could make sense of it. I accepted the responsibility willingly. I started balancing the checkbook, making the mortgage payments, and dealing with the insurance companies. Eleanor would sign any document I placed in front of her, never bothering to read the fine print. When it came to money, she trusted me without question. It was a strange irony that she could entrust me with her financial well-being, but couldn't trust me enough to defend my honor to her own son. Slowly but surely, more financial duties fell onto my shoulders. When the time came to refinance the mortgage, I was the one who handled all the documentation. When the property taxes were due, I was the one who wrote the check. When the homeowner's insurance policy needed to be updated, I was the one who spent hours on the phone. Eleanor was more than happy to let me manage it all, and I found a strange sense of comfort in having control over at least one aspect of this house, even if it was just the endless stream of bills. 2 years into our marriage, Eleanor made the decision to add my name to the property deed. "You're my husband," she stated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "This is your home as much as it is mine." It was one of the very few instances where she had ever so directly affirmed my position in her life. We visited the lawyer's office together and signed the necessary paperwork, establishing us as tenants in common. This meant that, legally, I now owned 50% of the house and had the right to sell my share independently if I ever chose to do so. Leo was incandescent with rage when he learned of this. "You're giving away Dad's house," I overheard him accuse Eleanor during one of their hushed, intense conversations that I was supposed to pretend I couldn't hear. "That man is going to sell it from under you the second you're gone and pocket all the money." "Don't be absurd," Eleanor retorted, but her voice lacked any real conviction. "He's not that kind of person." The seed of doubt, however, had been sown. I began to see it growing in Eleanor's eyes. Over the subsequent weeks, she started to ask questions about the bills, requesting to see bank statements and receipts. She had never displayed the slightest interest in our finances before, but now, suddenly, she was suspicious of every single expenditure. The realization that her son's poison was slowly seeping into her mind was a painful one. The house had transformed into a silent battleground, and I was losing ground every day. Leo's visits became almost a daily occurrence, and with each one he found a new, subtle way to remind me that I would never truly belong. He would rearrange the furniture back to the way his father had preferred it. He would replace the new bath towels I had bought with the faded, worn ones his father had used. He would cook Eleanor's favorite meals and make thinly veiled comments about how Richard's versions were always superior. "Dad's brisket was the stuff of legend," he would say, watching Eleanor take a bite of the roast I had prepared. Remember how he would spend the entire afternoon in the kitchen, making sure every detail was perfect? He never believed in taking shortcuts. The message was always the same. I was the shortcut, the inferior substitute, the man who could never hope to measure up to the saint that Richard had become in death. I began to find excuses to miss family dinners. I started spending more and more time away from the house. I began to question why I had ever believed this marriage could possibly succeed. Eleanor was a good woman at her core, but she was weak, and her weakness was methodically dismantling any hope we had for a happy life together. It was around that time that the idea of selling the house first entered my mind. It wasn't a malicious thought, not at first. It was purely practical. The place was far too large for just 2 people. Especially 2 people who were drifting further and further apart with each passing day. The upkeep was astronomical, with its antiquated heating system and the constant need for repairs. And the house was teeming with ghosts. Not just the ghost of Richard, but the ghosts of all my hopes and dreams of turning this place into a real home. I brought it up with Eleanor one evening, trying to sound as casual as possible as we sat watching television. "Have you ever considered downsizing?" I asked. "This house is an awful lot for just the two of us to manage." She looked at me as if I had just proposed setting fire to the entire neighborhood. "This is Leo's childhood home," she said, her voice firm. "He grew up in these rooms. All of his memories of his father are in this house. But Leo doesn't live here anymore," I pointed out, my tone gentle. "He has his own apartment on the other side of town." "That's irrelevant. This house is as much his as it is mine, perhaps even more so. He was born here." And there it was, the unspoken truth finally given voice. This was not my house, and it never would be. It was Leo's house, held in trust by his mother until he was ready to inherit it. I was merely the caretaker, the man keeping her company until Eleanor passed away, and bequeathed everything to her precious son. Despite this, I started doing some research on my own. Not because I was formulating a plan, but because I needed to feel like I had options. I looked up the sale prices of comparable homes in our area, studied the recent market trends, and made a few discreet calls to real estate agents for informal valuations. The house, it turned out, was worth significantly more than I had anticipated, nearly twice what Eleanor had paid for it 2 decades earlier. One realtor, a sharp and friendly man named Mark, was especially insightful. He had grown up nearby and knew the history of nearly every property on our street. When I described our house, his voice grew animated. "Oh, yes, I know the one. The beautiful colonial with the big wraparound porch. You know, I actually have a client, a cash buyer, who has been asking me about that specific property for months. He's pre-approved for a mortgage and is ready to make a move the moment it becomes available." I wasn't prepared to sell just yet, but the knowledge that I could was a strange and powerful comfort. For the first time since I had moved into that house, I felt a sense of agency, a measure of control over my own future. I might be ensnared in an impossible dynamic with Eleanor and Leo, but I wasn't completely trapped. I had a way out. The months dragged on, and the situation showed no signs of improvement. In fact, Leo's behavior seemed to escalate. He began to let himself into the house unannounced, using the key his mother refused to ask him to return. He would sort through our mail, making comments about our spending habits and questioning my purchases. He would move the living room furniture back to its correct position while I was out running errands, always arranging it exactly as his father had. "I'm simply trying to preserve the house's original character," he'd explain with a smirk when I would finally confront him. Dad had such impeccable taste. He knew how to make this place feel like a home. The implication hung heavy in the air. I did not, because it wasn't my home, and it never would be. During our 3rd year of marriage, Eleanor's health began to falter. It was nothing sudden, just the slow, creeping toll of age and accumulated stress. Her blood pressure was on the rise. She complained of a constant ache in her back. A perpetual weariness seemed to have settled over her. Her doctor advised her to reduce stress and take things easier. But living in a state of constant tension between her husband and her son was anything but easy. I suggested we try couples counseling, but Eleanor would hear none of it. "We don't need some stranger telling us how to live our lives," she insisted. I suggested that perhaps Leo could be asked to respect some basic boundaries, a suggestion that was met with a wall of icy silence. I even proposed a vacation, just the two of us, a chance to get away and remember why we had fallen for each other in the first place. But Eleanor refused to leave town, while Leo was in the throes of a messy divorce. Yes, Leo was getting a divorce. His marriage to Clara had been deteriorating for years, a fact he had conveniently omitted in his conversations with Eleanor. Clara was a good woman, quiet, diligent, and completely devoted to their two young children. But in Leo's eyes, she was dull and lacked ambition. She worked as a librarian and was perfectly content with their modest middle-class existence. Leo, however, craved more. He wanted thrills, drama, a wife who earned a six-figure salary, and accompanied him to exclusive restaurants. So, he began an affair with his boss at the advertising agency where he worked. It carried on for several months before Clara discovered it. When she did, their marriage imploded in a truly spectacular fashion. Clara filed for divorce immediately, seeking full custody of the children and an equitable division of their assets. Leo promptly moved back into his childhood bedroom in my house, our house, while he contested the divorce proceedings. And just like that, I was forced to share my home with the one person in the world who despised me the most. He was there every day, a constant presence, poisoning the very air with his bitterness and self-pity. He blamed Clara for being unaccommodating. He blamed the court system for being biased. He blamed everyone and everything but himself for the disaster he had single-handedly created. Clara is being vindictive, he would complain to Eleanor during their nightly strategy sessions. She's trying to take the children from me just to punish me. She's telling the judge I'm an unfit father, all because of one tiny mistake. One tiny mistake. That was his characterization of a months-long affair and the complete demolition of his family. Throughout the entire ordeal, Eleanor was his staunchest ally. She paid for his high-priced lawyer. She insisted that he move back home, rent-free, ignoring my quiet objections. When I gently suggested that he might contribute to the household expenses, or at least pitch in with the chores, Eleanor became defensive. "He's going through a terrible time," she would say. "The last thing he needs is his own family nickel, and diming him while he's trying to get back on his feet." So, I found myself looking after the children whenever Leo needed me to, even though the custody agreement was quite clear, and Clara had them the majority of the time. I would listen for hours every evening as he railed against Clara, never once daring to suggest that he might bear some of the responsibility for his situation. I watched this entire drama unfold with a mixture of disbelief and profound disgust. Here was a man who had betrayed his faithful wife, shattered his family, and traded his children's stability for a fleeting affair with his superior. And yet, Eleanor treated him as the victim. She showered him with endless sympathy and unwavering support, never once acknowledging the immense pain he had inflicted on others. Meanwhile, I, the husband, who had never been unfaithful, never lied, never betrayed a soul, was made to feel like an intruder in my own home. I was the one who didn't fit in, the one who couldn't be trusted, the one who failed to understand the sanctity of family loyalty. The divorce proceedings stretched on for 8 long months. 8 months of Leo occupying our home, monopolizing our kitchen, and consuming all of Eleanor's time and emotional energy. 8 months of being subjected to his endless tirades about Clara, while he simultaneously did everything in his power to make my life a living hell in countless small ways. He would use up all the hot water right before I needed to shower. He would help himself to the food I had specifically bought for myself without ever asking. He would leave his dirty dishes piled high in the sink, expecting me to clean them. He would smoke cigarettes on the back patio, a habit he knew I detested, and leave the butts scattered across the flagstones for me to sweep up. But the most agonizing part was watching Eleanor enable his atrocious behavior. When I would bring up Leo's lack of consideration, she would tell me to be more patient, that he was going through a difficult time. When I pointed out that he was treating me with open contempt, she would accuse me of being overly sensitive. When I asked, with thinly veiled frustration, how much longer he intended to stay, she replied that he was welcome for as long as he needed. It became painfully clear that in his mother's eyes, Leo could do no wrong, while I could do nothing right. I was the problem. I was the source of all the tension. I was the one who needed to change, to compromise, to be more understanding. During this period, I maintained contact with Mark, the realtor, not because I was actively plotting to sell, but because our conversations were a lifeline, a reminder that an escape was possible if the situation became truly unbearable. Mark mentioned on more than one occasion that he had a client who had been specifically inquiring about our street for months. "She's recently divorced," he explained, "looking for a fresh start in a place where her children can visit and feel at home. She's highly motivated and has all her financing in order." I was intrigued by this mysterious buyer, but Mark, ever the professional, kept her identity confidential. All I knew was that she was serious, she was qualified, and she was ready to act swiftly if the right house became available. The final, irrevocable break occurred on a Tuesday evening in late March. The three of us, Eleanor, Leo, and I, were gathered around the dinner table, eating a pot roast that I had spent the better part of the afternoon preparing. Eleanor was complimenting the meal, and for a fleeting moment I felt a surge of optimism. Perhaps, just this once, we could have a pleasant family dinner. But then Eleanor began to talk about her retirement plans and how she was looking forward to spending more time at home. "This house holds so many precious memories," she said, her voice warm with nostalgia. "Richard and I were so content here. Leo grew up in this house. One day, when I'm gone, it will be Leo's, and perhaps his children will grow up here too." She said it with such casualness, as if she were commenting on the weather, but her words struck me with the force of a physical blow. She had just declared in front of both of us that this house would never truly be mine. All my efforts, all my attempts to make it feel like a home were utterly pointless, because it had always been destined for Leo. I carefully placed my fork on my plate and looked at Eleanor. "What about downsizing?" I asked, my voice quiet. "We've discussed it before. This place is really much too big for us now." Eleanor shook her head, a dismissive gesture. "I have no interest in selling. This house has too much history, too much sentimental value. It just wouldn't feel right to have strangers living here." I wasn't willing to let it go. "Perhaps we could find a smaller place nearby," I suggested. "Something that could be truly ours, together. A place where we could create new memories, instead of being constantly surrounded by old ones." It was at that moment that Leo spoke. He had been sullenly silent for most of the meal, but now he leaned forward, his blue eyes flashing with a cold, contained fury. "You are not welcome in this house until you change your mind about selling it," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This was my father's house. It is my mother's house. And one day, it will be my house. You have absolutely no right to even think about getting rid of it." The words hung in the oppressive silence of the room. I could feel a hot flush of shame and anger creep up my neck, but I turned my gaze to Eleanor, desperately seeking her support. Surely she would remind her son that I was her husband and that I deserved to be treated with respect. Surely she would defend my right to have an opinion about the home we shared, but Eleanor just sat there. She didn't utter a single word. She didn't even meet my gaze. She simply picked up her fork and continued to eat her pot roast, as if nothing had happened, as if her son had not just informed her husband that he was no longer welcome in his own home. In that deafening silence, something inside of me didn't just break. It snapped. Like a cable pulled beyond its tension limit, like a piece of metal bent one too many times. Eleanor had made her choice, and it was not me. She would always choose Leo over me, She would always prioritize his feelings, his wants, his demands, over mine. She would always view me as the outsider, the man who had somehow imposed himself upon her real family. But what Leo didn't know, what neither of them understood, was that I had choices too. And I was on the verge of making the most significant one of my life. I finished my dinner without another word, cleared the plates from the table, and went upstairs to bed early. Eleanor never came up to see if I was all right. She never apologized for her son's deplorable behavior. She never even acknowledged that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. I lay awake for most of that night, not thinking, not planning, not scheming, but just feeling the raw rage surge through my veins like a current of electricity. By the time the sun rose, that white-hot rage had cooled and hardened into something else entirely, something colder, sharper, and infinitely more powerful. Determination. The very next morning, while Eleanor was at work and Leo was at a meeting with his lawyer, I called Mark. "I'm ready to sell," I told him, my voice devoid of any emotion. "That's wonderful news," Mark said. "I still have that client I told you about, the one who's been specifically asking about your property for months. Would you like me to arrange a viewing?" Something in the tone of his voice piqued my curiosity. "Who is the client?" I asked. There was a brief hesitation on the other end of the line. "Clara Morrison. She used to live over on Maple Avenue, but her ex-husband got that house in the divorce settlement. She's been desperately looking for something in the same school district so she can have her children for longer visits." Clara Morrison, Leo's ex-wife, the woman he had cheated on and then cast aside, the woman he had painted as a vindictive and unreasonable shrew, the woman Eleanor had never taken the time to get to know because she was too preoccupied with defending her son's distorted version of reality. A slow, cold smile began to spread across my face. The universe, it appeared, had a wonderfully wicked sense of poetic justice. "Tell me more about this Ms. Morrison," I said. Mark filled me in on the rest of the details. Clara had been awarded custody of the children 4 days a week and every other weekend. She had received a rather modest financial settlement from the divorce, but had lost their family home because Leo had successfully argued that it was a gift from his mother, a claim that Eleanor had backed up with a signed affidavit. Clara was, at 41, starting her life over with limited financial assets, but a stable job and an impeccable credit history. "She's a very nice woman," Mark added, "completely devoted to her kids. She's been searching for a house for months, but everything in her price range within that school district is either too small or in terrible condition. When I hinted that your property might be coming onto the market, her eyes just lit up." Of course they did. This was the neighborhood where her children had grown up, where they had friends, where they felt a sense of belonging. This was the street she had probably driven down 1,000 times, each time a painful reminder of happier days before her world was torn apart. "Set up the viewing," I instructed him. "But I want this kept completely under wraps. Don't mention to anyone else that we're even considering selling." Mark understood the need for discretion, and he arranged for Clara to see the house the following Saturday, a time when Eleanor would be at her weekly book club meeting and Leo would be with his children. I wanted to meet this woman, the woman who had been married to Eleanor's son, this woman whose life had been upended by the same selfish, entitled behavior that I was forced to witness every single day. Clara Morrison was not at all what I had been expecting. Based on Leo's venomous descriptions, I had pictured a bitter, resentful woman, consumed with a desire for revenge against her ex-husband. Instead, the woman who greeted me was quiet and thoughtful. She spoke in a soft voice and moved through the house with a gentle reverence, clearly battling a wave of powerful emotions. "I'm so sorry," she said, after Mark had introduced us. "This must be incredibly awkward for you, considering you're Leo's stepfather. I do hope my interest in the house doesn't create any hard feelings." "No hard feelings whatsoever," I assured her. "My primary interest is in finding the right buyer, not in navigating complicated family politics." Clara toured the house with a look of genuine appreciation. She ran her hand over the hardwood floors that Eleanor and Richard had installed 20 years before. She complimented the kitchen renovations that I had overseen the previous spring. She stood for a long time in the backyard, her gaze fixed on the old swing set that was still there from when her own children used to visit. "My kids would absolutely love that swing set," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They really miss having a yard to play in." Over the course of the hour, Clara shared her story with a level of honesty that I found both surprising and refreshing. She had loved Leo deeply and had been completely blindsided by his affair. She had tried to salvage their marriage, even suggesting counseling and a fresh start. But he had already checked out, his mind set on leaving. "I have to be honest," she said, her voice dropping even lower. "A part of me wants this house because it would give my children a sense of stability. They could walk to the same school, see their friends every day, have some consistency in their lives." She paused, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "But if I'm being completely truthful, another part of me wants Leo to have to drive past this house one day and realize just how much more he lost than he ever gained. Maybe that sounds petty, but I'm just so tired of being the one who always has to take the high road." "He portrayed me as controlling and unsupportive," Clara said, a deep sadness in her eyes. "He told the judge that I was trying to stifle his career and keep him trapped in a boring suburban existence. But the truth is, all I ever wanted was for our family to be together. I truly thought we were happy." The irony was staggering. Here was a woman who had genuinely loved Leo, who had wanted nothing more than to build a life with him, and he had thrown it all away for a sordid affair that had fizzled out just months after the divorce was finalized. His boss had never left her own husband, and Leo had ended up alone, embittered, and in a precarious financial situation. But Clara wasn't bitter. She was hurt, undoubtedly, but she spoke of Leo with a sense of sorrow rather than anger. Her primary concern was the impact of the divorce on their children, not on exacting revenge on her ex-husband. "I just want to give my kids a stable home," she explained. "They've been through so much turmoil already. If I could just buy a house in this neighborhood, they could stay in their school, keep their friends. It would make this whole custody situation so much easier on everyone." It was in that moment that I knew with absolute certainty that Clara Morrison was the perfect buyer for this house, not just because she could afford it, and not just because the sale would achieve my own objectives, but because she deserved it. She deserved a new beginning. She deserved a home where she could create new, happy memories with her children. She deserved the chance to transform her pain into something positive. And Leo deserved to see the woman he had so carelessly betrayed and abandoned, standing proudly on the porch of the house he had tried to claim as his birthright. We discussed the numbers, and Clara's offer was more than fair. It wasn't the absolute highest price I might have been able to get on the open market, but it was a reasonable offer, backed by solid financing. More importantly, she was in a position to close the deal quickly. The cash from her divorce settlement, combined with a small mortgage, would make the entire transaction straightforward and swift. "I will need to discuss this with my wife," I told Clara and Mark, "but I am very interested in moving forward with your offer." After they had gone, I sat alone in the quiet house, contemplating the gravity of what I was about to do. Eleanor would be devastated. She would never consent to selling the house, especially not to Leo's ex-wife. She would view it as a profound betrayal of everything she held sacred. But Eleanor had betrayed me first. She had betrayed our marriage every single time she chose her son's feelings over her husband's. She had betrayed my trust every time she permitted Leo to disrespect me in the home we were supposed to share. She had betrayed my dream of building a life together every time she made it abundantly clear that I was a temporary fixture, while Leo was a permanent one. I took out the deed from the safe and studied it intently. The joint ownership, as tenants in common, meant I had the legal right to sell my half of the property. With Eleanor's signature, we could sell the entire house quickly and without complication. Without her cooperation, I could force a partition sale through the courts, but that would be a long, messy, and expensive process. But there was another way, a much simpler way. Eleanor trusted me implicitly with all financial matters. She signed whatever documents I put in front of her, without so much as a cursory glance. In 3 years of marriage, she had never once questioned a single form I had asked her to sign. She trusted me completely with our money, even if she couldn't trust me enough to defend me to her own son. That trust was about to become her undoing. Over the next few weeks, I made my preparations with meticulous care. I gathered all the necessary paperwork for the house sale: the deed, property surveys, tax records, and mortgage statements. I conducted a thorough review of our joint finances and calculated the exact amount of money we would net from the sale after paying off the remaining mortgage and covering all the closing costs. It was a substantial sum, more than enough to purchase a smaller home outright with a considerable amount left over. I also found an apartment, a small but comfortable unit on the other side of town, close to shops and public transport. I secured a month-to-month lease, no long-term commitment, just in case things went south with Eleanor, and I needed a place to go in a hurry. The most difficult part was keeping the entire operation a secret from both Eleanor and Leo. I had to schedule my phone calls with Mark for times when I knew they wouldn't be around. I had to review the legal documents late at night, after Eleanor was asleep. I had to conceal my swirling emotions of excitement and anxiety behind a carefully constructed mask of normalcy. But then, I had been hiding my true feelings for 3 years already. I had become a master at pretending that everything was perfectly fine while my world was quietly crumbling around me. Adding a few more secrets to the existing pile was not a difficult task. By the end of March, all the paperwork was in order. Clara's financing was officially approved. The closing was scheduled for the first week of April. The only thing I needed now was Eleanor's signature on the sales contract, and the plan would be irrevocably set in motion. I chose my moment with tactical precision. It was a Thursday evening, and Eleanor was in a relaxed and unusually cheerful mood after a pleasant day spent with her friends from the book club. She had enjoyed a glass of wine with her dinner and was settled comfortably in her armchair. Leo was out for the evening, so we had the house to ourselves. "I need you to sign a few papers," I said, my tone casual, as I brought her a small stack of documents along with her evening tea. "Just some routine financial matters, and a limited power of attorney form so I can handle more of the banking without having to bother you." Eleanor barely even glanced at the papers before reaching for her pen. This was our established routine. I managed the paperwork. She provided the signature. No questions were ever asked. The power of attorney document was legitimate and necessary, a standard form for household and financial affairs that Mark had helped me get notarized earlier that day. Eleanor never questioned it. After all, I had been handling all of our banking for years. But that night, for some reason, she hesitated. Perhaps it was the thickness of the document stack. Perhaps it was a subtle tremor in my voice. Or perhaps she was finally, after all this time, beginning to pay attention to the financial details she had so long ignored. "What exactly am I signing?" she asked, her eyes actually scanning the first page. My heart began to pound in my chest, but I kept my voice steady and calm, almost bored. "It's a property tax appeal," I said, tapping my finger on the document at the top of the pile. "The county assessed our property at a higher value than comparable homes in the neighborhood. This should get us a significant reduction." That part was, in fact, true. I had prepared a legitimate property tax appeal, and it was sitting right on top. Eleanor read through it quickly and signed without any further questions. Underneath that were two more routine documents, an update to our insurance policy and a form to change our mortgage payment schedule. Both were legitimate, both required her signature, and both were perfectly ordinary. She signed those as well, barely giving them a second glance. Then she came to the sales contract. I held my breath as she looked at the first page. The document was drafted in typical legalese, dense and impenetrable. At a quick glance, it could have been mistaken for anything: another insurance form, a mortgage refinance document, more tax paperwork. "This one is quite long," Eleanor commented, flipping through the pages. "It's a rider for our homeowner's insurance," I said smoothly. "They're requiring more detailed coverage documentation because of the recent storm damage in the area. It's mostly boilerplate legal language." Eleanor nodded and proceeded to sign on every line I had marked with a small yellow sticky tab. She trusted me. She trusted me completely, even when some deep-seated instinct might have been telling her to read more carefully. Her faith in my honesty overrode any suspicion. Within 5 minutes, I had every single signature I needed, including the power of attorney that would grant me the legal authority to act on both of our behalf in all financial transactions. Eleanor had absolutely no idea that she had just given me the legal power to sell our house out from under her. The closing wasn't just scheduled for the following Friday. With Clara's cash offer, her pre-approved financing, and my newly acquired legal authority, it was now a virtual certainty. Eleanor finished signing and pushed the stack of papers back towards me. "Anything else?" she asked, settling back into her chair with her tea. "Nothing else," I said, carefully gathering the documents. "I'll get these filed first thing in the morning." But instead of filing them, I drove them straight to Mark's office. By 9 a.m. the next day, the sales contract was officially submitted, and the closing process was formally underway. There was no going back now. I spent the following week in a state of controlled panic. Every time Eleanor looked at me, I was convinced she could somehow see what I had done. Every time the phone rang, my heart leaped into my throat, certain it was someone from the bank or the lawyer's office calling about the sale. Every time Leo came to visit, I braced myself for him to announce that he had heard rumors about the house being on the market. But nothing happened. Eleanor continued with her normal routine: book club, television, occasional lunches with friends. Leo continued with his daily litany of complaints about his divorce, his ex-wife, and the general unfairness of his life. Neither of them had the slightest inkling that their world was about to be turned completely upside down. The closing was set for Friday afternoon. That morning, I packed 2 large suitcases with my most essential belongings and placed them in the trunk of my car. Not because I was planning on leaving immediately, but because I needed to be prepared for any eventuality. If Eleanor reacted violently, if Leo became threatening, I wanted to have the option of walking away cleanly and without delay. I also composed a letter for Eleanor. It was not an apology, because I felt no remorse. It was not an explanation, because she should have understood years ago why our marriage was failing. It was simply a statement of facts. What I had done, why I had done it, and where she could find me if she decided she wanted to talk. The closing itself went off without a hitch. Clara arrived at the lawyer's office with a certified check in hand and a smile that radiated pure joy. She was finally getting her fresh start, her opportunity to build a stable and loving home for her children. Mark handled all the details with his usual professional efficiency. Within 2 hours, the house legally belonged to Clara Morrison. I drove home slowly, acutely aware that this would be the last time I would make this familiar journey. I had lived in that house for 3 years, but in all that time, it had never once felt like a home. Now, it belonged to someone who would truly appreciate it, someone who would fill its rooms with laughter and love instead of bitterness and resentment. Eleanor's car was in the driveway when I pulled up, along with Leo's. They were both inside, most likely in the kitchen, engaged in their usual afternoon ritual of dissecting Leo's ongoing personal dramas. I could hear the murmur of their voices through the open window as I sat in my car for a moment, steeling myself for what I was about to do. I walked into the house to find them exactly where I had pictured them, sitting at the kitchen table with cups of tea and the remnants of Eleanor's afternoon snack. They both looked up as I entered, and Eleanor offered a small smile. "How was your day, dear?" she asked, just as she had hundreds of times before. "Interesting," I replied, taking a seat directly across from them. "I have some news to share with both of you." Something in my tone must have alerted them that this was not going to be a normal conversation. Eleanor carefully placed her teacup back in its saucer, and Leo's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I sold the house," I said, my voice calm and even. "The closing was this afternoon. The new owner will be taking possession tomorrow morning." The words hung in the still air of the kitchen like a live grenade. Eleanor simply stared at me, her face a mask of incomprehension, as if I had just spoken to her in a language she didn't understand. Leo's expression shifted rapidly through a series of emotions: confusion, then disbelief, and finally, pure, unadulterated rage. "What on earth are you talking about?" Eleanor asked at last. "You can't sell the house. We never agreed to sell the house." I pulled a copy of the sales contract from my briefcase and placed it on the table in front of her. "You signed the papers last Thursday," I said calmly. "Right here at this table. You signed every single line that required a signature." Eleanor grabbed the contract with trembling hands and began to read it frantically. I watched as the color drained from her face as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Her name was there, in her own elegant handwriting, on every signature line. The date was clearly marked. The terms were explicit. The sale was completely legal and binding. "You deceived me," she whispered, her voice hollow with shock. "You told me these were insurance papers." "I told you what you wanted to hear," I corrected her. "Just as you've been telling me what you thought I wanted to hear for the past 3 years. The only difference is that my deception actually accomplished something." Leo snatched the contract from his mother's hands, and his eyes scanned the document. When he reached the buyer's name, his face went completely white. "Clara Morrison," he read aloud, his voice barely audible. "You sold our house to Clara, to my ex-wife." "I sold my house to the highest bidder," I replied coolly. "The fact that the highest bidder happens to be your ex-wife is merely a happy coincidence." Leo exploded. He shot up from the table so forcefully that his chair toppled over backward, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to physically attack me. His face was a dark shade of red, and his hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. "You vindictive snake," he screamed. "How could you do this? This was my father's house, my childhood home. You had no right." "I had every right," I responded, keeping my voice perfectly level. "My name is on the deed. I own 50% of this property. I can sell my share anytime I choose." "But you sold the whole house," Eleanor said, finally finding her voice again. "You can't sell my half without my permission." I turned my gaze to her, a flicker of something close to pity in my eyes. "Eleanor, you signed a sales contract for the entire property. You gave me your permission when you affixed your signature to those documents. The fact that you didn't take the time to read what you were signing does not render the contract null and void." Eleanor stared at the papers in disbelief, her hands shaking as she flipped through page after page of dense legal language that she had signed without a second thought. "But I trusted you," she said, her voice plaintive. "I trusted you with everything." "Yes, you did," I agreed. "You trusted me with the bills, with the finances, with all the tedious paperwork you couldn't be bothered with. But you never trusted me enough to defend me to your son. You never trusted me enough to make me feel welcome in our own home. You never trusted me enough to build a real marriage with me." "That's not true," Eleanor protested weakly. "I love you. I married you." "You married me because you were lonely," I said. "And you kept me around because I was useful. I paid the bills, I cooked your meals, and I never complained when your son treated me like a piece of dirt on his shoe. But love, real love, requires respect, Eleanor. It requires a partnership. It requires choosing your spouse over everyone else, at least some of the time." Leo was pacing the kitchen like a caged tiger, muttering a stream of curses under his breath. Suddenly, he spun around to face me. "When?" he demanded. "When does she take possession?" "Tomorrow morning," I said. "You'll need to have all of your things out of here by then." "My things?" Leo shrieked. "This is my house. I live here." "Not anymore," I said simply. "Clara Morrison owns this house now. Whether or not she chooses to let you stay is a matter between the two of you." The look of pure horror that washed over Leo's face was almost worth the 3 years of misery he had put me through. He was finally, at long last, experiencing the same feeling I had endured every single day, the gut-wrenching realization that you don't belong in the one place you thought was your home. Eleanor was still staring at the contract, shaking her head in a state of shock. "There must be something we can do," she said, her voice filled with desperation. "We can hire a lawyer. We can claim fraud or coercion or something." "You can certainly try," I said. "But you signed that power of attorney voluntarily, giving me full legal authority to handle our property matters. The buyer is completely legitimate. She's paying cash well above market value, and the transaction is already closed. Any legal challenge you mount will cost you tens of thousands of dollars in attorney's fees for a case that you have almost no chance of winning." The stark reality of the situation was finally beginning to penetrate their shock. Eleanor looked like a woman who had just been run over by a truck. Leo looked like he was seriously contemplating my murder. "Where are we supposed to go?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. For the first time since I had begun this conversation, I felt a twinge of sympathy for my wife. She wasn't an evil person, just a weak one. Her greatest failing was her complete inability to stand up to her son. And now, she was paying the ultimate price for that weakness. "I've put a deposit on an apartment on the other side of town," I said gently. "It's small, but it's comfortable. There's room for both of us, if you're interested in trying to work on our marriage without Leo's constant interference." Eleanor glanced at her son, who was glaring at both of us with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred, and then her eyes shifted back to me. "What about Leo?" she asked. "What about him?" I replied. "He's a grown man with a life of his own. His divorce is finalized, his custody arrangement is settled, and he has a job. It's high time he found his own place to live instead of hiding out in his childhood bedroom." "I'm not leaving," Leo declared, his voice ringing with defiance. "This is my house. I don't care what kind of papers you tricked my mother into signing. I was born in this house, and I am not going anywhere." "That's your choice," I said calmly. But Clara Morrison is the legal owner now, and she has every right to have you arrested for trespassing if you refuse to leave. Is that really the kind of example you want to set for your children?" At the mention of his children, Leo's defiant facade finally crumbled. He had been so consumed by his own rage and his inflated sense of entitlement that he had completely forgotten about the bigger picture. His kids would inevitably hear about this. They would know that their mother had bought the house and their father had been thrown out of his grandfather's home. The humiliation would be both absolute and public. "You planned this?" he accused, his voice thick with venom. "You've been planning this for months, haven't you? This whole thing is just revenge because I never accepted you." "You're absolutely right," I admitted, feeling no shame. "I did plan this, but not for months, for years. Every single time you disrespected me in my own home, I thought about this moment. Every time your mother chose your feelings over mine, I planned for this day. Every time you made it crystal clear that I would never truly be a part of this family, I prepared for my exit." Eleanor was looking at me as if she was seeing me for the first time. "I don't understand," she said, her voice plaintive. "If you were this unhappy, why didn't you just leave? Why did you have to go and destroy everything?" "Because leaving would have meant walking away with nothing," I explained. "It would have meant sacrificing my time, my money, my effort, and my dignity. I have spent 3 years of my life trying to build a future with you, Eleanor. I've paid the bills, I've maintained this house, and I have put up with treatment that no husband should ever have to endure. I was not about to just walk away empty-handed so that you and Leo could go on pretending that I never even existed." "But the money," Eleanor said desperately. "What about our money? The proceeds from the sale?" I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a cashier's check, and placed it on the table next to the sales contract. "Your half of the proceeds," I said, "minus the mortgage payoff, closing costs, and realtor's commission. It's all perfectly legal and above board." Eleanor picked up the check with a trembling hand. It was a substantial amount of money, enough to live on quite comfortably for several years if she was careful. But it wasn't enough to buy another house in this neighborhood, and it certainly wasn't enough to maintain the lifestyle to which she had become accustomed. "This is it?" she asked. "This is what 30 years of my life in this house is worth?" "This is what your half is worth," I corrected her. "My half is worth the exact same amount. The difference is, I'm using my money to start a new life. You can do whatever you please with yours." Leo snatched the check from his mother's hand and stared at the numbers. "We could fight this," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "We could claim diminished capacity or financial exploitation. Mom isn't thinking clearly. She would never have signed these papers if she had understood what they were." His voice was becoming louder, more frantic. "I'm going to call the police right now. This has to be illegal. You can't just steal someone's house. I'll have you arrested for fraud." "Go ahead," I said calmly. "But while you're wasting your time and money fighting a losing battle in court, Clara Morrison will be living in this house with her children." "I'll sue you personally," Leo shouted, jumping to his feet again and pointing a shaking finger at me. "I'll make sure that everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of person you are. I'll tell the whole neighborhood, all of Mom's friends, everyone at her book club. They will all know that you are nothing but a gold-digging manipulator who tricked a grieving widow." He was pacing again, his voice becoming more and more shrill. "And Clara, that pathetic loser, if she thinks she can just waltz back into my life and take everything from me, I'll make her life a living hell. I'll tell the school board she's an unstable influence. I'll tell her boss she's vindictive. I will make sure she never has a single moment of peace in this house." "Leo." Eleanor's voice cut through his tirade like a knife. It was quiet, but firm. "Stop." He spun around to stare at his mother, clearly shocked by the sudden authority in her voice. What did you say?" "I said stop," Eleanor repeated, slowly rising to her feet. "Just stop. This is enough." For the first time in 3 years, she was telling her son no. The fight seemed to drain out of Leo all at once, and he collapsed back into his chair. For the first time since I had met him, he looked utterly and completely defeated. All of his arrogance, all of his entitlement, all of his unwavering certainty that he could bend everyone around him to his will, it was all gone. "Why, Clara?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Of all the people you could have sold this house to, why her?" I considered feeding him a lie, giving him some noble-sounding explanation about how Clara deserved a fresh start. But I had spent far too many years suppressing my true feelings. It was time for absolute, brutal honesty. "Because I knew it would hurt you the most," I said simply. "You destroyed that woman's life because you wanted something more exciting than the love and stability she offered you. You took her children, her home, and her dignity, and now she gets to start her life over in the very house where you grew up, with more than enough space for her kids to visit and play in the same backyard where you once played." Leo's eyes filled with tears. "She'll poison my children against me," he whispered. "They'll come here for their visits, and she'll tell them all about how their father ruined everything." "Clara is not that kind of person," I said. "She's not vindictive like you are. She will probably be gracious and kind, which will only serve to make your betrayal of her all the more glaring by comparison." Eleanor was still holding the check, staring at it as if she hoped it might magically transform into something else if she just looked at it long enough. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you decide what kind of woman you want to be," I said. "You can come with me to the apartment and we can try to build a real marriage, one based on mutual respect. Or you can choose your son over your husband one last time and figure out your own living arrangements." "Don't make me choose," Eleanor pleaded. "Can't we all just find a way to work this out? Maybe Clara would be willing to sell the house back to us." I almost laughed at her naivety. "Eleanor, Clara doesn't have to sell anything to anyone. She owns this house, free and clear. Why on earth would she give up her fresh start just so the man who cheated on her can move back into his childhood bedroom?" The truth was finally, irrevocably, sinking in for both of them. This wasn't a temporary setback that could be overcome with a clever strategy. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding that could be cleared up with better communication. This was permanent. This was final. This was irreversible. I stood up from the table, picking up the contract and my copy of the check. "I'll be at the Hampton Inn tonight," I said. "Room 237. If you want to try to make our marriage work, Eleanor, you are welcome to join me. We can go to the apartment together tomorrow and start over." "And if I don't?" she asked quietly. "Then I will move into the apartment by myself, and you can figure out your own life," I said. "But either way, I am done living in a house where I am not wanted, and I am done being married to a woman who refuses to stand up for me." I walked to the door, then paused and turned back to take one last look at them. Eleanor looked broken and bewildered, like a woman who had woken up to find herself in a stranger's life. Leo looked devastated, but still seething with anger, like a spoiled child whose favorite toy had just been taken away as a punishment. "For what it's worth," I said to Eleanor, "I really did love you once. I truly thought we could build something wonderful together. But love isn't enough when only one person is willing to fight for the relationship." Eleanor opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. What could she possibly say? That she was sorry? That she would try to do better? It was far too late for apologies and empty promises. The time to fight for our marriage had been 3 years ago, when I first began to feel like a stranger in my own home. I left them there, sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by the smoldering wreckage of their comfortable assumptions about how life was supposed to unfold. Eleanor would have to decide if her loyalty to her son was worth more than her marriage to me. Leo would have to decide if his pride was worth more than his relationship with his mother. But those decisions were no longer my concern. I had made my choice, and I was, at long last, free. I drove to the hotel by a long, scenic route, winding through the town where I had spent 3 fruitless years trying to build a home. It was a beautiful place, with its tree-lined streets and immaculate houses. In another life, under different circumstances, I could have been happy here. But happiness isn't just about a physical location. It's about the people you choose to share your life with, and whether or not those people value you enough to make room for your dreams, your feelings, and your very existence. I had spent far too long trying to squeeze myself into a space that was never meant for me, trying to earn love from people who had already decided that I wasn't worthy of their respect. Once I got to the hotel, I called Mark to confirm that everything had gone through smoothly with the title transfer. Clara Morrison was now officially the new owner of the house, and there were no legal complications or last-minute snags. "How did your wife take the news?" Mark asked, his voice cautious. "About as well as you'd expect," I said. "She's in shock, but she'll survive. People are far more resilient than they give themselves credit for." That night, I sat in my quiet hotel room, eating takeout pizza and watching the late-night news, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. For the first time in 3 long years, I wasn't walking on eggshells, constantly bracing myself for Leo's next passive-aggressive attack, or Eleanor's next failure to defend me. For 3 days, my phone remained silent. I began to wonder if Eleanor had made her choice by default, by simply staying with the son who had always come first in her heart. A part of me wasn't even surprised. On the 4th day, my phone finally rang. It was Eleanor, and she sounded utterly exhausted. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice quiet. "We can talk," I said, "but I'm not changing my mind about the house. That's a done deal." "I know," she said. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. "I've been staying with Leo. I thought maybe if I chose him, we could figure something out together. Maybe get lawyers involved, try to reverse the sale somehow." I waited, refusing to make it any easier for her. "But he doesn't want my help," she continued, her voice cracking slightly. "He wants my money. He just keeps asking me when I'm going to hire a lawyer, when I'm going to sue you, when I'm going to fix the mess that I created." She paused again. "Last night, he told me that I wasn't welcome at his apartment anymore unless I was there to discuss legal action against you. He said that having a pathetic mother was embarrassing, and he didn't want his friends to see me moping around." I felt a flicker of sympathy for her, despite everything that had happened. "I realized something. Sitting in that parking lot," Eleanor said. "I spent 3 years trying to keep everyone happy, and all I managed to do was make everyone miserable, especially you, and especially myself. Leo doesn't love me. He loves what I can do for him, and when I couldn't do anything for him anymore, he threw me away, too." "Eleanor." "No, please. Let me finish," she said. "I never understood how badly Leo was treating you because I was so terrified of conflict that I just convinced myself it wasn't that serious. But you were right. You were right about everything. About him, about me, and about what our marriage needed to have any chance of survival. If you'll still have me, I want to try to be the wife that I should have been from the very beginning." I thought about it for a long moment. Eleanor wasn't a bad person, and I had truly loved her once. Perhaps, with Leo finally out of the picture, we could actually build something real together. Perhaps the shock of losing the house would be the wake-up call she so desperately needed. "One chance," I said, finally. "But things have to be different this time. No more choosing Leo over me. No more allowing him to disrespect me. No more pretending that keeping the peace is more important than protecting our marriage." "I understand," Eleanor said. "I'll be at the hotel in 20 minutes. She was there in 15, carrying a single suitcase and wearing the expression of a woman who had finally realized the true value of what she had almost lost forever. We talked until the sun came up, and for the first time in our entire marriage, Eleanor truly listened to what I was saying. She apologized for her weakness, for her failure to protect me, for the years she had spent making me feel like an outsider in what should have been our shared home. It wasn't enough to completely erase the damage, but it was a start. The next morning, we drove to the old house to gather the rest of our belongings. It was barely 8 a.m., but Clara Morrison was already there with a moving truck, directing movers who were carrying in furniture and boxes. She was polite but distant when I introduced Eleanor, clearly uncertain of how to navigate the incredibly awkward situation. Leo was there too, furiously loading boxes into his car with sharp, angry movements. He had obviously spent the entire night packing, and he looked exhausted and utterly defeated. When he saw Eleanor and me arrive together, his face hardened into a mask of contempt. "So you chose him?" he said to his mother, not even bothering with a greeting. "I chose my husband," Eleanor said quietly, "the way I should have from the very beginning." "After everything I've been through," Leo said bitterly. "After all the support I gave you during the divorce, you're just going to abandon me now?" "I'm not abandoning you," Eleanor said. "I am simply, finally, putting my marriage first, the way I should have done years ago." Leo looked as if he was about to argue further, but at that moment, one of Clara's children came running into the yard. A little girl, about 6 years old, with her mother's kind eyes and a joyful smile. She made a beeline for the swing set, and her delighted laughter filled the air as she began to pump her legs, soaring higher and higher. The sound seemed to completely deflate Leo. The presence of this innocent child was a stark and powerful reminder of just how much he had lost through his own selfish choices, and how much Clara had gained by choosing to move forward instead of looking back. We finished loading our things in a tense silence, with Clara maintaining a respectful distance and Leo refusing to speak to anyone. As we were about to leave, Eleanor paused and looked back at the house one last time. 30 years, she said softly. 30 years of my life in that place. But not the rest of your life, I said, taking her hand. We still have time to build something new. Eleanor squeezed my hand and nodded. You're right, she said. Let's go home. But before we could get into the car, Clara approached us. She looked nervous, but determined. I want you both to know, she said quietly, that I'm not doing this to hurt anyone. I just want a fresh start for me and my kids, a place where we can build new memories. Eleanor looked at this woman, this stranger who now owned her family home, and I could see the struggle of emotions on her face. Finally, she extended her hand. Take good care of it, Eleanor said simply. There's a lot of love in those walls. Clara shook her hand solemnly. I will, she promised. And thank you for letting me give my children the stability they deserve. Leo watched this exchange with an expression of pure, stunned disbelief. His ex-wife and his mother were shaking hands, making peace, while he stood there with his car full of boxes and no permanent place to call home. This is insane, he muttered, but all the fight had gone out of his voice. This is absolutely insane. No, I said quietly. This is what consequences look like. Our new apartment was small but comfortable, with 2 bedrooms, a modern kitchen, and a balcony that caught the morning sun. It wasn't as grand as the house had been, but it was ours, truly ours, in a way the house had never been. There were no ghosts here, no shrines to a previous life, no emotional baggage lurking in every corner. Eleanor adapted to apartment living much better than I had anticipated. She seemed almost relieved to be free from the constant burden of maintenance and upkeep that the big house had demanded. She joined a local senior center, took up watercolors, and started making new friends who knew nothing of her complicated family history. Most importantly, she kept her promise regarding Leo. When he would call, demanding that she take his side in some new manufactured drama, she would politely refuse to get involved. When he criticized me or our new living situation, she defended me without hesitation. When he tried to manipulate her with tears or guilt, she remained firm. It wasn't easy for her. Leo was her only child, and changing the deeply ingrained pattern of their relationship after 34 years required a constant and conscious effort. But she was finally learning the lesson I had been trying to teach her for 3 years, that love without boundaries isn't really love at all. Leo struggled immensely with the new dynamic. He had grown accustomed to having his mother's unconditional support and undivided attention, and to suddenly find himself held to the same standards as everyone else was a profound shock to his system. He tried every strategy in his playbook to regain controlled tears, anger, guilt trips, even using the grandchildren as leverage. But Eleanor held her ground. The house, meanwhile, was flourishing under Clara's care. Within a month, she had remarried in a small, beautiful ceremony held in the backyard. Her children had settled into their new school and were making friends in the neighborhood. Clara had planted an extensive garden and was hosting barbecues for the neighbors. The house had a new life, a new energy, a new and palpable happiness. Leo had to drive past the house regularly to pick up and drop off his children for their visits. Each time he saw the vibrant flowers that Clara's new husband had planted, or heard the sound of laughter coming from the backyard where his own children were playing with their new step-siblings, he was forcefully reminded of everything he had thrown away through his own selfish actions. But the most bitter pill for him to swallow was watching how well Clara's new husband treated his family. The neighbors, who had known Leo all his life, warmly welcomed this new man. His stepchildren clearly adored him and spoke about him with a level of affection that Leo's own children had never shown him. The house that had been the site of so much tension and misery during Leo's marriage was now filled with the very kind of love and stability he had so carelessly discarded. About 6 months after the sale, I ran into Clara at the grocery store. She looked healthier and happier than I had ever seen her. "How's the house treating you?" I asked. "Like a home," she said with a genuine, radiant smile. "The kids love having a yard again, and my husband has completely transformed the garden. It's as if the place was just waiting for the right family to come along and appreciate it." "And Leo?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I really wanted to know. Clara's expression became more serious. "He's struggling," she said. "The kids tell me he's incredibly bitter about everything that happened. He blames everyone but himself. You for selling the house, his mother for signing the papers, me for buying it. He just can't seem to grasp the concept that actions have consequences." "What about his relationship with his mother?" "It's complicated," Clara said. "Eleanor tries to maintain contact, but he makes it very difficult. He can't seem to accept that she chose her marriage over his demands. He keeps waiting for her to come back to him, groveling and apologizing, but she's not going to do that." "That must be hard on Eleanor," I said. "Probably," Clara agreed. "But some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Leo spent his entire life believing that his wants and needs were more important than anyone else's. Maybe losing the house and his mother's unconditional support will finally teach him a little humility." A year after the sale, Eleanor and I renewed our wedding vows in a small ceremony at our apartment complex's community center. It was nothing fancy, just a simple exchange of promises witnessed by our new friends and neighbors. But it meant more to me than our original wedding ever had, because this time, Eleanor was marrying me with the full knowledge of who I was and what I was capable of. She had learned that I was not the meek, accommodating man she thought she had married. I was a man who would fight for my own happiness, a man who refused to accept anything less than I deserved. I was a man who would take decisive action when pushed too far, and who would not apologize for protecting myself from people who treated me poorly. But she had also learned that I was fiercely loyal to those who earned my loyalty, forgiving of those who demonstrated a genuine change of heart, and capable of building something beautiful when given a fair chance. Leo was not invited to the ceremony, though Eleanor had offered to include him if he was willing to treat me with respect. He declined, still unable to accept the new reality of his mother's marriage. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he eventually moved to another state, taking a job that paid less but got him away from the daily painful reminders of everything he had lost. His children stayed with Clara most of the time, visiting him only during school holidays. He had lost not just the house and his mother's unwavering support, but also a significant part of his relationship with his own children. It was a harsh consequence for his behavior, but it was also a wound that was entirely self-inflicted. He'd had countless opportunities to change his course, to treat me with basic human decency, to accept that his mother had a right to remarry and find happiness. Instead, he had chosen pride, selfishness, and entitlement, and those choices had cost him dearly. Eleanor and I lived quietly and contentedly in our apartment for 3 more years before her health began to seriously decline. When it became clear that she needed more care than I could provide on my own, we moved into a senior living community with assisted care services. It was another adjustment, another downsizing, but we made it together as true partners. Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in spring, 5 years after we had sold the house. Her final years had been, by far, our happiest together. Freed from the toxic influence of Leo's resentment and manipulation, she had finally learned how to be a wife instead of just a mother. And I had learned how to be a husband to someone who truly valued me. Leo came to the funeral. Of course he did. He was Eleanor's only child, and despite everything that had transpired, he had loved his mother in his own selfish, complicated way. He looked older, tired, and somehow broken by the years of estrangement from his family. He tried to approach me after the service, perhaps with the intention of apologizing, or attempting a reconciliation now that Eleanor was gone. But I had no interest in his belated regrets or his sudden desire for family harmony. Too much damage had been done, and too many years had been wasted. "I'm sorry for your loss," I told him politely, but I didn't linger for any further conversation. Eleanor was gone, and with her, any reason for Leo and me to pretend that we could ever be family. I inherited Eleanor's portion of our savings and investments, which provided me with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my days. It wasn't great wealth, but it was security and independence. More importantly, I had learned that I was stronger and more capable than I had ever imagined. The house where I had once felt so profoundly unwelcome continued to thrive under Clara's ownership. Her children grew up there, happy and well-adjusted, bringing their friends home from school and hosting birthday parties in the backyard. Her husband filled the gardens with flowers and vegetables, and the neighbors all spoke of them as the kind of family that makes a neighborhood a better place. Sometimes I would drive past the house just to see it. The paint was always fresh, the lawn was green and meticulously kept, and there were always signs of an active, joyful family life. Bicycles in the driveway, toys on the porch, windows thrown open to let in the fresh air and sunlight. It looked exactly as I had always hoped it could look when I lived there, a vision I could never achieve because of the toxic atmosphere Leo had created. Clara and her husband had turned that house into a real home, the kind of place where children feel safe and loved, where neighbors are welcomed as friends, and where every room holds happy memories instead of bitter ones. It was everything the house could have been if Eleanor had only been strong enough to stand up to her son from the beginning. But perhaps things worked out exactly as they were meant to. Maybe Eleanor and I needed to lose that house in order to find our real relationship. Maybe Clara and her family needed that fresh start more than we needed to keep fighting a war we were never going to win. And maybe, just maybe, even Leo needed to lose everything in order to finally, at long last, understand the consequences of his actions. I lived for 8 more years after Eleanor's death, spending my final years in a small but comfortable senior community where I made new friends, took art classes, and volunteered with local literacy programs. I never remarried. Eleanor had been enough wife for one lifetime, but I was never lonely. When my time came, I faced it not with regret, but with a sense of satisfaction. I had learned to stand up for myself when it truly mattered. I had refused to accept less than I deserved from the people who claimed to love me. I had taken control of my own destiny when others tried to make me a victim of their selfishness. Most importantly, I had learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is to refuse to enable another person's bad behavior, even when that refusal causes them pain. Eleanor became a better wife only after she was forced to face the consequences of her weakness. Leo's children got a more stable home life only after he lost the power to manipulate their mother. Even Clara found happiness and peace by getting the fresh start she so richly deserved. The house I had sold out of anger and desperation became a symbol of new beginnings rather than old grievances. The money I had claimed for myself gave me independence and security in my final years. The marriage I had fought to save became stronger and more genuine only after I had proven that I was willing to lose it rather than continue to accept disrespect. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't punishment. It's simply refusing to allow other people's limitations to define your life. Sometimes, the greatest victory isn't in defeating your enemies, but in walking away from battles that were never worth fighting in the first place. And sometimes, the most important lesson you can teach someone is that actions have consequences, choices matter, and love without respect is nothing more than comfortable exploitation. But there is one more thing I learned, something that took me years to fully grasp. That moment when Leo looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't welcome in my own home, that wasn't just an act of disrespect. It was a gift. It was the moment I finally stopped trying to earn love and acceptance from people who had already decided I wasn't worth the effort. It was the moment I chose myself over their approval. He thought he held all the power in that moment. He thought his mother's silence was a declaration of his victory. But what he didn't know was that he had just handed me the keys to my own freedom. The house he tried to banish me from became the very instrument that bought me a new life. And by the time he realized what had truly happened, it was far too late to take back the words that had changed everything forever. That's the thing about power. It's not always where you think it is. Sometimes, the person sitting quietly at the table, absorbing the insults and meticulously filing away every single slight, is the one who is holding all the cards. Sometimes, the person that everyone underestimates is the most dangerous one in the room. Leo learned that lesson the hard way. But then again, some lessons can only be learned through loss. Some people can only understand consequences when they are standing on the outside, looking in at the house that used to be theirs, watching someone else's children play in the yard, where they once felt so safe and secure. I learned these lessons the hard way too. but I learned them completely. And in the end, that knowledge was worth more than any house could ever be. The moment my stepson looked me dead in the eye and told me I wasn't welcome in my own home, he thought he was ending the conversation. But in reality, he was just giving me permission to start a new one, a conversation where I did all the talking, and the only voice that mattered was my own.